Hi. Thanks, Russ. Appreciate everybody coming in today. We're going to talk about library components, one of the newer kids on the block for SharePoint Framework solutions. It's going to be a lot of fun, so appreciate you attending. All right, some housekeeping to get out of the way. We want to mark our calendars for the upcoming Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference. Now, you might otherwise know this as the Microsoft SharePoint Conference. It's been rebranded to absorb a lot of other technologies beyond SharePoint. So look to schedule that together at Las Vegas, and seems to be auto going forward on me. So we'll get that taken care of. All right, want to thank all our sponsors today. We know that events like this are possible, not as many costs for us these days with virtual, but we still have them and we want to support them by visiting them throughout the virtual event. You want to raffle, you want to win something? VR is becoming bigger and bigger, so make sure you check out the raffle URL at the bottom there, giving away 3 Oculus Quest all-in-ones. So as it mentions, visit the vendor booth sessions, watch the videos, and submit your answers to the raffle. And we'll need at least 5 correct answers. And of course, a lot of the sponsorship is being donated. We always want to consider donating ourselves to good events and charitable foundations. So certainly want to look forward to doing that. My name is David Warner. I'm an MVP. I work for Catapult Systems, and I'm a member of the PNP core team, for those that are familiar with patterns and practices. I love sports, as you can see, maybe by the helmets behind me, as well as the pictures on your screen. But I also love communicating and collaborating with the community. So don't hesitate to reach out to me afterwards if you have any questions, you want to sync up, or you simply just want to collaborate on some projects. All right, so let's dive in. Let's start talking about SPFx tooling, right? So what exactly is the tooling that we need to use and have available to us to take advantage of SharePoint Framework Library Components? Well, we know it starts with SharePoint. That's a given. And then we're going to add in some TypeScript, some gulp, some Webpack, some VS Code, some Node, and some Yeoman. Now, these are the core pieces that make a SharePoint Framework Library Component possible. There's a lot of other ways in which we can enhance the framework. We'll talk about that today. But these are the core pieces. And the primary piece that we're going to end up talking about today is this little guy here, Webpack, right? How does it all work together? Well, in the end, when you compile, Webpack makes that happen. And that's what we're going to see some power behind on the SharePoint Library Components today. We're going to take advantage of how a SharePoint Library Component can be bundled and packaged to take advantage of the enhancements that Microsoft has provided to us. All right, so what are the challenges without library components? Why are they necessary? Why are they valuable to us? Well, when you consider an out-of-the-box web part bundle, we can include a variety of technologies. You can see some of that here. So we've got things like PNP.js, jQuery. This little guy here in the, this little guy here in the middle, maybe that's some common functionality within our organization, right? Maybe it's proprietary code that we need to include in every web part. So when we do that, it gets packaged here into this little web part, and then we want to do that for every web part, because if we have proprietary or we're taking advantage of PNP.js or jQuery, well, of course, we want to utilize that in a repeatable way within all our web parts. But what happens is when we put all of these web parts on the page, as you can see right here and here, what happens? Well, we're getting a duplicated amount of content, right? jQuery is loaded twice. PNP.js is loaded twice. Our proprietary functions and methods and software, maybe API connections, that's all loaded twice, right? So now we're duplicating the amount of code. Well, what does library components provide? Well, as you can see, a variety of challenges include dependencies on CDN. So we also could reference library or external components in that way, right? So we could reference them if they're on CDNs. But as you can see, there's a variety of challenges that occur with that, right? When we have external CDNs, things could happen. And so we could have problems in that sense as well. So what does that look like in a demo, right? So let's take a look at our first demo. We're going to take a look at a lot of demos today. So let me set the context for what you're seeing on the screen. We have a collection of demo components that we're going to look at today. We can see them all here, a variety of samples. We're going to be utilizing our command editor here so that we can do things like bundling, scaffolding a new library component to see what that experience looks like. And then we see over on the left, we've got VS Code, and we've got all of our samples referenced here that we're going to look at. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the default bundling. right? And so if we see here, I've got two samples, just simple out-of-the-box web parts. They're going to include and import jQuery, right? One is a web part orange, one is a web part purple. Got to stay on brand, right? And so if each of those are going to import something like jQuery, let's go ahead and take a look. We're going to open up our orange, and we're going to go ahead and look at our web part here. And we're going to see right here, we're importing jQuery, right? Now, if we were to go in and bundle this and package it together, well, what's going to happen in that default experience is it's going to include jQuery, because when we put that web part on a page, we don't necessarily know that jQuery may have been loaded somewhere else. So what SharePoint Framework does is it encapsulates and isolates and includes all of our dependencies into our web part. So if we're using jQuery, then, or PNP.js, or maybe Moment.js, or some other framework or library, we need that to be associated and accompany our web part. So when our web part gets put on a page, we know that jQuery or our associated library is available to us. All right. So what does that mean for us? Well, if I go into the orange, and I've already done, for purposes of time, I've already done a bundling on almost all of these so that we don't have to wait for NPM to do its work. We see here on our output, now this is not minified, and all these are going to not be minified, so we'll be able to kind of compare apples to apples. We see it's 300K. And this is the only thing we've done in this web part. We've just simply imported jQuery, put it to use, bam, that's it. Very simple, right? We see that unminified, we're looking at 300K. All right, so now let's go ahead and close that. Let's come over to our purple web part, right? Again, the exact same thing. We'll look at the source, we'll look at web parts. No different. We're simply importing it. Now, these are two different web parts, right? But they're both doing the exact same thing. And we can see that if we go down below here, we're simply just setting something to be our background color of purple, right? And so that's what these web parts are doing, very simple. Now, if we go ahead and go up to that web part here, right? We're gonna look at the exact same web part right there. We're gonna go into its files, and we're gonna see, what do we see? Another 300K. Right? And so now, although these web parts are both doing the exact same thing, there's got to be a better way, right? Because they're both using jQuery. Wouldn't it be better if there was some way for us to be able to reference that as a single location in a single place, but both web parts could tap into that copy or version of jQuery? Because in this case, when we put each of these on a page, then we're duplicating the number of jQuery instances on our page. And while 300K unminified is not huge in this day and age of quick internet, we still, every little byte, every little amount of code on our page matters. So we want to make sure we're as efficient as we possibly can. And so that's the challenge with an out-of-the-box default bundling. So what does a library component look like? What's the architecture of a library component, right? Well, it's the ability to take everything we've talked about so far, right? jQuery, PNP.js, we see that here. We see jQuery. Maybe we're going to put moment.js into it. Maybe we're going to go ahead and, like I said, we have proprietary code within our organization that we need to include in every single solution we build, right? Those can all go into our library component. The key to be aware of is that there's nothing special or unique away from web parts or extensions that a library component is. It is still a SharePoint framework solution, right? So don't get scared and think, oh, this is a whole new thing I got to learn. If you're familiar with SharePoint framework solutions, then you're going to be comfortable with how library components work. You can build your components, your functionality, your methods within that, all in the same way you would have done it within your web part or your extension. It's just simply a separate solution. Right? What are the challenges solved with library components? We talked about what are the challenges without them. Well, in this case, we can see that we have multiple web parts on our page still, right? Each of these is a web part. But instead of including a copy of those libraries, PNP.js or jQuery, or that proprietary software as we see right here, we are able to call in that library component on demand. And this library component is available to all of our web parts, right? So we can see that the library component, when built once, we build it once, all the web parts are available. It is available to all the web parts and all the extensions, right? So we're able to take advantage of that write once, use many place benefit within library components. All right, so how do you create a library component? Well, let's take a look at that demo. So we're going to go ahead and go back up to our collection of web parts here, and we're going to go ahead and create one. Now, I'm going to go ahead and use the skip install. We've got our command prompt down here pointing to that location, right? So that's where we're going to go ahead and be creating this. And we're going to step through the creation of that. And let me just, trying to paste to make it easier, and my ordered list had other things to say about it. Okay, there we go. So we're going to go ahead and do the skip install here because we don't need to install NPM. Takes a while. If you have a lot of RAM, it goes faster, which I do, but we still don't want to waste time looking at NPM loading. So I preloaded every demo today with the exception of this one, just so that we can kind of see what the experience looks like when we go to create one. Okay, so you go to create it just similar to how you would have within a web part or an extension. And all right, that is strange. Am I misspelling something? All right, let me do that again. And something must be strange there. I apologize, I tested this right before. You create it. Let's see, list 0. Unless something got changed. Should be there. And that's strange. For some reason, it doesn't have my SharePoint generator. So I apologize for that. It should have been there. So while we're doing, just gonna go ahead and clear this. When you do go create the solution, it walks you through where you would normally go ahead and select a web part. It gives you the choice of creating a library. Now, it's important to keep in mind, I do already have one created here. We can see that that was created. It does have the exact same signature. I apologize, for some reason the generator did not get installed in my root. I don't want to take the time to do that now because we got a lot more to cover. But it creates an out-of-the-box extension or library component for you, and you choose it in the exact same way. If you've created a web partner extension, it's just simply a choice. The important point to note, though, when you do create it, is the library extension needs to be in a solution in and of itself, right? So you're not going to go in and add a library extension to a solution that you already have a web part in or an extension in. You want to go ahead and make sure that you install it into a solution by itself, because it can't cohabitate with the exact other solutions that are available to you within SharePoint. And you wouldn't want it that way anyways. The point of a library solution is to have functionality that is available to you that other web parts and other extensions can tap into, right? Okay. All right, so creating a library. So the next step is, well, how do you connect a web part or an extension to a library component, right? So the first step is you want to prepare your library component. So once you've created a library component, you have to use an NPM symlink. All right, and what this does, and we'll see this, is it instantiates a connection to your library component in your global node modules. And so it effectively creates a global node module for you, but it's kind of a shortcut. And what happens is that shortcut points to the location on your hard drive where your library component solution lives. But what that does is it allows your web parts or your extensions to reference it as if it is a global node module, right? So you create that with the npm link command, and we'll see how to do that. Once you've linked your library component up into your global node modules, then you need to connect your web part to that node module. And you also use the npm link command for that. But instead of just simply saying npm link, what you do is you actually use the name of your extension, right? So once you've linked your web part, then you want to update your package.json to reference that, because it's as if you're referencing another NPM package like jQuery, PNP.js, or something like that, right? So you want to take a look at that. So let's see what that looks like. All right, so let me set the context for everything. We have a library component created here out of the box. This is just a simple library component. So let's take a look at what that looks like. We're going to go ahead and open it here, close that. We're going to go into our library component. And we can see that every library component out of the box just simply creates a default class and a default method for you called name. And it just simply returns the name of your library component. Now, this is obviously where we'll create additional functionality for our library component, but out of the box, this is what it provides you, is that, excuse me, that default name method that just simply returns the name, and it's got a default class here, library component, out of the box library. So let's go find that. We need, now that we've got that created, the first thing we need to do is we need to instantiate that NPM link. So we're going to go ahead and grab that URL, and I'm going to change our directory, clear screen, okay. And so what we do is we just simply do NPM link, right? Now, when I do that, it's going to go and make it look like it's doing an NPM install. And this is the one time we'll go ahead and actually live do this, because it's important to see what happens. And it doesn't take very long to do an NPM link. This is not like a full NPM install. What we see, though, the important thing to see is we're going to go ahead and take a look down here. Pay attention to that area right there. What we see is that it has created a reference in my global node modules, right, to the location, which is that one wrapping right there, to my out-of-the-box library component, right? And if I were to now do an NPM, and we'll clear the screen here, and we'll do an NPM, and you may have seen this earlier. I'm going to do a list. We're going to look at depth equals 0 -g, and we're going to look to see what our global node modules include. What this is going to list is our symlink right here that we created, right? So now we have that little guy right there can be included and referenced as a node module within our web part. Okay, so now we've done kind of the first half of that. We've instantiated our library component to be available to our other components such as web parts. Okay, the next half is to go in and make our web part available, right? Okay, so what we need to do is we want to grab that name. We saw that right here, right? to-libcomp library component out of the box, right? So we want to copy that, and we want to go up to our web part, which is that one right there, right? So this is the demo sample web part I've set up to consume the library component. So we're going to want to go ahead and let me just paste that over here so I have that available. Okay, and we'll want to go into that, and I'm just going to go ahead and change the directory to that location, clear the screen so we're near the top, and now you can see that we're inside of that directory. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do npm link, and this is where we said that second half, we're going to want to go ahead and paste in the name of the link we want to create. So we've said npm link. Now, if I had just done npm link, it would have created a symlink to my web part in the global node modules, but that's not the point. That was the point for the library component. So now what we're saying is, hey, I want you to, within my web part right here, I want you to create a link to that guy, the library component. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. And that happens pretty fast, and we see now a bigger trail. So what we're seeing, and it's kind of hard to follow, but because there's a lot of directory there, but we can see that it's looking at my library component web part, node modules, to library component, and we'll take a look at that. If we go into the node modules up here, you can see it just created a symlink to that location, and we can see the name of it right here. It was just created that specific time, which is right now. So we can see that it created that, and we see that it's pointing at the location, which is now our node module. So that second connection right there is pointing at the program files, Node.js, node modules, library component, which is then in turn pointing to the location of our library component, right? So it's kind of this way to kind of connect all the dots for something that is not really necessarily a library component, or excuse me, a global node module, right? All right. And then of course, you always feel free to ask any questions within the chat. We see those there. So if there are any questions, don't hesitate to ask them. This is obviously not quite like a team meeting where you can just chat audibly, but don't hesitate to ask any questions. All right, so now we've kind of gone through and made that connection within NPM, right? So let's review. We instantiated that node module like experience, that symlink for our library component. We've seen what that looks like. Then we've gone into our web part. We've connected that web part to that symlink through the npm link command, connecting it to the web part, and we can see that happens here. Now there's a gotcha that we'll try to cover at the end if we have time. I've got a lot of material in this slide deck for you to take home with you that'll be available to you after the session and after the event. If we don't get to cover it all, there's plenty of videos that I've created that show you how to do it, but I will quickly talk about one gotcha. If you come in and you create a symlink to your library component, like we just did, and then we come in and do something like an npm install of maybe some other small library, maybe jQuery, maybe PNP.js, maybe whatever we want to include. When you do an npm install, it's going to get rid of your symlink. And you may not know that unless you know that. And if you don't know that and you do an npm install and everything's working, and then you try to do a gulp serve on your web part and it blows up on you because it can't find your library component, and you think, what in the world? I've done this, it was working, all I did was install jQuery, why they shouldn't even affect each other, what's going on? It's simply because it has removed your symlink. And so you'd want to go through the process of re-establishing that connection. So we'll try to do that real quick because we are doing good on time. npm install jQuery. I'm just going to simply do that. It should be fairly quick. That's a smaller library. And if you keep an eye, we're able to sort here by date modified. We can see that that's there. And once it instantiates that library, well, what we should see is that library component disappearing on us. And again, this can throw you for a loop, and we see it's almost done, and in fact, it's already removed our symlink, right? So now if we come here, we're still sorted by date modified. We see, great, we've got jQuery loaded for us, but what we don't see is our library component, right? Bad. So simple fix for that, you just reinstantiate the link, right? So npm link, call that, and now we see it's shown back up again. Just a quick side tip, because it can get you. That's a big gotcha, and I've included that in the slide deck in the end as a bonus tip, and I've created a video on it as well, so you can always check that out at my website. Okay, so now we've connected everything, right? So how do we make them work within the web part? Well, first things first. Let's go ahead and do a gulp serve on our web part. Let's make sure that is building. Okay. And we'll go ahead and take a look at that. Should be loading here any minute. And what we're going to do in the process is we're going to go into our library component and we're going to make a small change, right? So we're going to change the return statement here on our library component to something a little different, something a little more fun. Well, welcome to M365 Virtual Marathon. So now, instead of just returning the name of my library component, when I go to reference this name method within my solution, I'm going to go ahead and return that, right? And we're going to display that in the web part. So let's go ahead and now go into our web part where we made that connection. We'll come down here and you can see I was testing some of that, so we'll go ahead and delete that. You don't need to see that. I should have removed it. I apologize. All right, so here is our fresh web part, right? The first thing you want to do when you open up your web part is you want to make sure that your package is referencing your solution, your library extension solution, right? And now when you're developing, you actually don't have to make that connection, right? And I'm using a little bit of a couple versions old because that's when they debuted. But of course, this is all supported today. You want to go ahead and reference your library component right here. All right, oops. Right. Now, this is important when you're packaging and deploying because what happens is this is going to make sure that the web part doesn't auto include your library component functionality. When you're developing your library component, you actually don't need or absolutely have to have this dependency listed here. And sometimes when I'm developing, I won't because there's other things that can happen that you need to be aware of. But you always want to make sure that that's there when you go to package, because otherwise what's going to happen is when you do the import within your web part of your library component, it's actually going to bundle it because you're not listing it as a dependency. So it says, hey, well, you're using this thing, but if it's not listed as a dependency, I don't know where else to go look for it. So I need to make sure I bundle it in your web part, and then you won't benefit by the library component at all. You'll just be making a copy of your library component, which is not what you want to do. So you want to make sure you do those dependencies, and that's where I talked about putting into the package.json. All right. So here we are back in our web part. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to do first things first. We want to go ahead and create the import statement for our library component. Version not helping me. And we can see that it's import star as my library. Now this could be called anything, right? I could simply call that anything I want, and that's no problem. We could call it, virtual marathon library. The point is you're creating that. The connection here is what matters, right? This is what matters. And you can even see that it's pointing to that location where my library component lives, right? So it is aware because we did that symlink. So it knows that that library component is living within my solution location right there. Right? So we know that it is working correctly. Okay, now we need to instantiate our library component and get access to that name method. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and paste that in. And what I'm doing is I'm just creating a variable here, and it's creating a new instantiation of my library component. So we see my library is what it was called up here, right? So we've got that, that connection right there occurring. And that's where we get that from. And that library component out of the box library, well, that is the class name right up here, right? So I'm switching over to my library component TS file. We see that that is the connection we're making right there. We're making an instantiation of that exported default class. Okay, so the next step would be to access our name method in a meaningful way, right? And so we want to return that string right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and you could do that in a couple of ways. If you wanted to utilize whatever is being returned by that method, we could do something like let name var equal, and then we can say library component instance dot, and we see there's that name, right? There's our method, our name method. So then I could use that if I wanted to, and then I could do something with name var if I needed to. But in this case, you don't absolutely need to. If you're just simply getting a return text like we are right here, we just want to take that and display it somewhere, well, we can do that, right? So we could come right down here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to paste a little paragraph tag, and we see what we're doing is we're referencing those two things right there. Oops, keep doing that. Right. So I'm using that, and I'm referencing the name, and I'm just simply looking to display it. Right. So now if I save that, we can see over here, it's reloading, it's rebundling, it's repackaging and building. Everything looks good. And so we're going to come into our workbench. What I've done is I've just loaded my hosted workbench right here in a site called Library Components. We've started that, we're not overdue. And we'll refresh, and we should come in here and we can see the web part, right? So there is my web part that we're working on behind the scenes, and we're gonna go ahead and load it, and bam, there we have it. Welcome to the M365 Virtual Marathon, right? So we made changes to our library component, and we are able to reference it. Now, what does this look like behind the scenes, right? So what happens is our web part is loaded. You deploy both packages, right? You'd be deploying your library component. You'd be deploying your web part. Behind the scenes, SharePoint takes care of connecting them, right? As long as we've listed that dependency inside of our package.json, which I showed you at the outset of the web part, then it's going to know how to find each other. SharePoint, Microsoft takes care of that for us. And if I had added another web part onto this page, then we would not see multiple copies of the library extension loaded. Both web parts could tap into that name method that we see right here, right? Both of those web parts could tap into that, but only one instance of the library component would be loaded on the page. So now, instead of that problem we talked about early on, where we had multiple instantiations of our functionality, whether it was jQuery, PNP.js, proprietary methods being written, now we don't have that problem anymore. We're able to load that library component, and by the way, it's on demand. So if our web part on our page does not use that library component does not get loaded. In the past, some had used extensions to kind of fabricate a library component experience. Maybe you'd have that loaded, it'd always be loaded. The challenge with something like that is that it's always loaded, right? An extension is always going to be loaded, but the library component is on demand. It's not going to load the functionality we just created. This name method does not get created or injected into the page unless a web part on the page is using it, right? All right, a lot we've covered so far. So let me close that and back up. All right, optimized bundling. Library components optimized bundling. So you may be thinking, well, so far, we've gone over some massive benefits of library components, and this is great. I want to go start creating library components for all that functionality that I've created, whether it be proprietary, a library, and something else. And I want to create this write once, use many experience for all my web parts. So you go in and you start loading up your library component, right? You throw in jQuery and PNP.js and proprietary, and you add some more, and you add some more, and you add some more. Well, all of a sudden, you have an overloaded library component, right? So it's not a magical button or a magical fix. What kind of experience would this give your users? Because you may be using a web part that uses one little piece of that library component, but now you're getting all these other things being added into the page that you may or may not be using, right? So you start feeding your library component and you start putting more and more into it. And any Wreck-It Ralph fans out there may recognize this, right? Keep feeding the bunny and feed the bunny and feed the bunny. And eventually you feed the bunny and he's looking like this. It just can't take in any more pancakes, right? What are your users going to respond with? What's the page load experience going to be like? You're going to see something like that. That is not at all what you want, right? And so what does a non-optimized bundling look like for a library component? Well, again, it is a SharePoint Framework solution. You have a single SharePoint Framework solution JS bundle, right? And that could result in a large bundle. And at that point, you start wondering, well, is it any better than just including it in my web part? Because at least I know with the web part, if I've got multiple on the page, they each need it. It's going to be there for them, and I may be duplicating jQuery, but at least I know each web part needs it. Well, in this case, I may have, as we see down here, Moment.js, right? But I may only need jQuery. Or I may be loading a whole bunch of other stuff on one page on one web part that uses jQuery or some proprietary methods that we've written. And it only uses one of those, but all of them are getting loaded onto the page. And that could be a significant impact, right? What if we could optimize our bundling? And by the way, you could do this with a web part extension and as you can see, a library component. We can actually optimize the bundling of our library component so that the individual components of our library component are loaded on demand, asynchronously, as needed, just in time, right? So let's paint a picture. We've got something loaded on a page that uses jQuery. So if we go ahead and look at our experience here, it loads jQuery right there, right? So we load a web part on a page. When it needs jQuery from our library component, then the library component will load it. Even though moment right here is included in the library component, because we're going to optimize the bundling of our library component, then we're not going to load moment at that time, right? So we don't have to worry about all of the heaviness of Moment.js. And that, while it is valuable, nobody likes to work with dates and times, right? We all hate it. Moment is valuable, and there's other ones that are valuable, but oftentimes they're weighty. And if you don't need them, well, you certainly don't want them loaded on your page because of the girth and the weight that comes with it. So we want to look to take advantage of optimized bundling. All right, so let's take a look at a quick demo of that. And we got about 13 minutes left, and I got a couple of things I want to share with you. So we're not going to do a full packaging, but as I mentioned, I've got all of these examples already there for you and ready to go. So let's look at optimized bundling. Let's go ahead and pull this up over here in our code. Right. So what I've done here is I've created a separate TypeScript file for each item that I want to import, right? So maybe I'm going to use Moment in certain situations. Maybe I'm going to use jQuery. Maybe I'm going to have some custom functions that are, like I mentioned, proprietary to our organization. By putting them all in a separate TypeScript file, we're able to, and we'll take custom functions as an example, create a default class and methods that work within that, right? Simple example. And then if we look at our bundling of our library, well, now we're able to create async await functions here, right, to include the different information that we need. So there is one for jQuery, public async await, right? Public async await, public async await. That's the one we just looked at. And we're returning our custom functions. We are importing it using asynchronous availability, right? Now you may, if you're not familiar with this, you may say, well, that's great, but you just showed us what happens is it creates in the default experience a bundle that everything is in the same file. So how does it work in that it's going to call them in asynchronously? If it's all one file and you call any one of them, you're getting the whole family, right? Well, that's the beauty of the async await. If we come over to our optimized bundling, we're looking at our JS optimized bundling here. Let's look at the dist folder. So now what's happening is it actually separates out into what's called chunks for us, right? Actually, here, let me do that. It's separating out those different asynchronous libraries that we need into chunks. And if we look at the girth of them, the size of them, right, together, we're looking at some pretty big pieces. So there's the JS, there's the JS, there's the JS, right? Our custom is small. We saw just a few lines. I can tell you that this little guy right here is Moment. That's a big mamma jamma. And then jQuery is no slouch on its own, right? All those put together into a single file. Well, what happens when you only need that? You only need 2K worth of methods, but you're going to get all that as one. But with if you do default bundling, but with the dynamic bundling, you get to take advantage of this JavaScript chunking, which creates them out separately into separate JS chunks, right? And so what happens is when your library loads and your web part says, hey, I use this library, what gets loaded is the blue item, right? The blue JavaScript file. And that is only 13K. That payload is pretty small. But what that gives us is it gives us a gateway to all these things when we need them, right? But only when we need them. So if I have a web part that utilizes JavaScript, or excuse me, jQuery or Moment, I can set it up to where it's only going to load. And if it's on demand, or if it's on load that I need it, it's going to load in right away. My render method is going to call it. I'm going to instantiate that part of the library component. I'm going to call in that method. Bam, it's going to return Moment, right? But what if I don't need Moment until I click a button? What if there's some event in our web part that says, hey, I don't really need Moment until someone says, show me the current time in Finland, right? I want to know what time it is in Finland. Click a button. Well, at that point, you can asynchronously load that Moment file. Of course, it's going to be a little smaller than that when it's minified and bundled for production. This has just been bundled for dev, so it doesn't minify it. It'll get smaller, but still, you can see the payload is significant. So you save that time, and if the person that's loading your web part doesn't ever need to know what time it is in Finland or Toronto or Denver or whatever the case may be, then guess what? That doesn't get loaded. And you've saved performance on that page by optimizing the bundling of your library component. Okay. All right, so hopefully you've seen the value of that. And again, optimized bundling is not something that is unique to library components. You can do that within web parts. So if you have a web part that utilizes that kind of functionality, there's examples at the Patterns and Practices repo. Definitely go take a look at those. You could take advantage of this functionality. All right, now you may like this. So we're doing good on time. I'm going to go ahead and give you this bonus demo now. Simultaneous parallel development is what I've called it, or SPD. We all think of SPD as SharePoint Designer. We cringe when we hear that. Should have been dead, right? Although it does the whole Monty Python. I'm not quite dead yet. Crops up. We need it for workflow. But from this SPD perspective, simultaneous parallel development, it's very unlikely that we're going to ever work in totality on our library component and then go work on our web part. It's very likely that we're going to want to actually kind of go back and forth. We're going to want to go ahead and create something in our web part, right? We may scaffold out our library component, build a minor amount of functionality, a baseline foundation of functionality, and then we kind of iteratively want to update it, tweak it, add to it, etc. So at that point, we want to go ahead and go back to our web part, and we want to instantiate it, we want to reference it and import it, and then we want to start accessing it. Okay, now I need to go back to my library component. Let me go ahead and stop the gulp serve of my web part, reinstantiate the gulp serve of my library component, make changes, build, bundle. Okay, go stop that. And you can see the frustration mounting, right? You're going in this rinse, wash, repeat that is not very comfortable at all. Because a library component has no interface, while you do need it to gulp serve for it to auto rebundle and rebuild when you're making changes, you don't need to display anything on the screen unless you're specifically working with a web part. So the fact that it's using that port that the web part is means it doesn't have to use that port. So let's take a look at what that means, right? So I'm going to go ahead and we've got this guy here, which is pointing at our web part. I'm going to go ahead and kill that. And then we're going to come back to it is using our out-of-the-box library component here. I'm going to just open up a command prompt there, and we're going to shrink this guy up so we can see what happens. Just kind of place it there. All right, so now we got that open. The key here is we want to gulp serve both of these, right? But if we do that, what's going to happen is it's going to give us an error on the second one we gulp serve, right? Because it's going to see a port conflict. But we know that the library component doesn't really need to display anything. So we're not really needing to connect to it through the port. We know that our web part is connecting to the library component through the NPM linking mechanism, the symlinks, right? But we know we want to go back and forth. Okay, so let's go into our web part. We want to make sure that our package has that. All right, so I'm just going to re-add it. I'm going to save that, close it, and we'll close some of this other stuff here too. Okay, good. Now, the key is we're going to come into our library component, and we're going to go into the serve for our library component. And we can see we've got the port right there, right? Typical port for SharePoint Framework solution. Yeah, we get it, no problem. Let's just change that. Anything. I'm choosing all 5s. You can choose whatever your favorite number is. Maybe you want a Spaceball special 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Same combination as your luggage. You could do that, no problem, right? So we're going to save that. And now what we're going to do is we're going to come in here and we're going to gulp serve our library component. And we're going to see it start to go through its motions in a moment. And so let's go ahead and actually let me open up our code here so we can see some. We're going to make some changes to the code so we can see what happens once it serves over here. It's trying to do its thing. That's fine. Now we're going to come over to the web part. We're going to open that up as well. We know that we've already got an instantiation of that. And we can see right here when that's done. Okay, that's reloaded. Let's scroll up a little. See right here, localhost started 5555, right? So we know that when we gulp serve on our web part, there's not going to be any collisions. If we had started this and then we went to gulp serve on our web part, we would have saw red. It would have blown up on us, right? Because there would have been a port conflict, and our web part wouldn't really have worked. We wouldn't have been able to access it through the workbench. But now, let me just go ahead and clear the screen here. We'll do a gulp serve here on our web part, and we see that it is opened up, web packing, reload. But if I go back up here, zoom in, well, this is exactly what we expect to see, right? Fantastic. Okay, cool. So what benefit does this give us? Well, as I mentioned before, we would have had to kind of stop gulp serving, rebuild, rebundle, et cetera, et cetera. Watch what happens when I go into my library component and I'm going to say, welcome to the blah, blah, blah. Hope you have a great day. Say that. Notice what happened behind the scenes? It just barely noticed it. In fact, let me shrink this so we can see it in totality, and I'll close my files here. And I will just remove that, save, bam. It rebuilt, rebundled, right? What if I were to go ahead and create another public method called M365 PNP, right? String return welcome to the PNP community, right? Okay, great. I'm going to save that. We see it's rebundling. Now I'm going to go over to my web part here. I've already got my instance. Looks like that had messed up there. Okay, and now I'm going to go ahead and since I've saved my library component, I should be able to come in here and look at that. M365 PNP is available to me just simply because I referenced it as a dependency. I saved it. I've got them both gulp serving. I didn't need to go in and turn one off and on the other and then refresh them and go back and forth by gulp serving in some sort of weird, odd experience. I simply was able to do that, save it, and now you see our web part is repackaging and good to go. Right? So one very cool bonus tip, if you find that you like library components and you're working with them a lot, that's a technique that I found very beneficial. Here is the information on how all that works, right? So you can take advantage of that. All right, chaining multiple library components. We don't have time for this. You're going to be able to take advantage of it. I've created videos for it, but essentially you can create sort of an inception of library components. So you could create a host library component that kind of works as like a broker. In this example, I've got an icon broker. For many of you that know me, I'm a big iconography fan, and I can create multiple library components by which the broker can call, as we can see here. And so I can break it up into multiple little minor pieces, and so you can actually create this kind of chaining of multiple library components.
Hey, David, right. do you want to address some of the questions real quick?
Yes, I actually. Oh, there is some now. Great. Okay. All right. Last time I looked was a few minutes ago, and there was nothing. Screen code barely visible. Sorry, I had upgraded or upsized that. Let me see here. Give me 1 second. How does this library component get linked to the web part after deployment? it is in the local drive. Well, it wouldn't be. So you would be deploying both. You'd get, at the end of the day, if you got a web part and a library component, you have 2 SPPKG files. And that's part of the gulp package solution for production. It will create 2 SPPKG files, but that dependency link in your package.json will connect them together. And so you just want to make sure you deploy both of them. If you were to deploy a web part that calls a library component, but you didn't deploy your library component, then it wouldn't obviously work. You wouldn't have it. Is library component by default globally installed when deployed to tenant app catalog? It's up to you. You can turn that on, yes, to globally deploy, and that's what I would recommend, because there's really no interface. Code has to call it. There's no danger of installing it where someone else could use it and in a way that could be problematic. Could we have private components? Not right sure what I know what that means. I mean, a component is kind of private in itself. You could, you know, deploy it again. It's something that sits behind the scenes, and unless you have code calling it and knowing how to call it, it's unlikely it's going to work. So I think they're kind of private in and of themselves. Yeah, React component, I wouldn't think why you wouldn't. In fact, Alex Terentiev has a fantastic session on React components and library components together. So look that up. Alex is a good friend of mine. Awesome session. If you are interested in that, do not miss his. After creating a library component link to web part, changes the process. We need to link again. Yeah, I mean, you don't have to link again. You don't want to remove stuff from library components if you have web parts out there using them. But if, you know, it depends on if you already have your library component created and you add it, you would need to rebuild it, right? So that the web part knows it's available. If you added a new method, just like I did, I went and saved my library component in the parallel development experience. So yeah, they need to be aware of each other if you've done that. So you know, if you're calling a new method, then you would need to rebuild and bundle and all that and make it available. Is async loading detrimental for small files? As a rule of thumb, you know, tomato for that question. The question is async loading detrimental for small files? Is there a general rule of thumb for how big a file needs to be before async provides noticeable benefits? I kind of like to think of it, if it's not something that's going to load on the page immediately, then we don't need it, right? Or we don't need it to be loaded. We can call it asynchronous. So if it's small, there's a chance it's not going to get loaded. Then I don't care how small it is. It's okay to call it in later if it's small, because they may never need to get loaded to begin with, and that's available. That's important. Will the recording available at session? Yes, I believe it will. Can we use no browser to avoid the port issue? No, all that does is it just doesn't spin up a browser, but it still uses the same port. Typo, I think that was probably for the little missing. This session will be recorded. Yes. So, okay. I think we covered all the questions, and I think we're a little over on time anyway. So we want to make sure we have plenty of time for the next speaker to set up. So I appreciate all of your attending. And again, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. That's my Twitter. That's my email, my blog. Again, a lot of these concepts, I've either put videos out there available for you to see again, or samples in the Patterns of Practices repository. And if you don't know what that is, I encourage you to learn about it. You can go to aka.ms/m365 PNP. I'll bring this over right there, and you can see that, right? Lots of samples here, lots of guidance. We are here for you in the community to show you how to take advantage of a lot of the features in SharePoint. So take advantage of the opportunities that are available to you. Other than that, appreciate the time, and hope you guys have a fantastic conference between today and tomorrow. There's another session that I'm doing with Hugo Bernier tomorrow, mid-morning on the Pacific time, on animation techniques within SharePoint Framework Solutions. So some cool, fun things. If you're a young Frankenstein fan, then that's our theme, but appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. Excellent job. Thank you. Folks, so we're going to get